Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum. More specifically, we're going to be discussing the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, you probably noticed I've been making a lot of videos about Ethereum recently. And the reason is because I think it is a good measure of the health of the altcoin market. And going into 2025, I've said that I think Bitcoin dominance will go down in 2025. Therefore, I think it makes sense to really focus on ETH right now. Now, fortunately, I've been on the right side of the ETH Bitcoin valuation for several years. And if you're new to the channel, essentially with ETH Bitcoin, I turned bearish on it right here in May of 2022, just before the drop. And then, yes, I felt like a genius when it came down here. And then, yes, I got my face ripped off when it came back up here. But then ultimately, it's worked out pretty well, right? It's worked out really well so far. And at this point, I have to say, I mean, I think ETH Bitcoin is very close to carving out a low. It is possible that the low is in at 0.04. That's the highest point I've said for 2.5 years that would mark the bottom, right? So, you know, don't give me the, well, why can't you just commit? I said 0.03 to 0.04 for literally like the last 3 years when most people kept calling for alt season. And here we are, it just went to 0.04. There is a non-negligible chance that that is the low. And if ETH Bitcoin does not go below 0.04 before the end of the year, then I think it is the low. But there is still a reasonable chance, and maybe even greater than a 50% chance, that by December, it's possible that ETH Bitcoin could go sub 0.04. But I want to show you two potential paths. And I'm basing them on the 2016, 2019 paths. And then I remember to myself, I'm like, well, 2024 looks a little bit different than 2016, and it also looks a little bit different than 2019. So why should I expect it to end like either of them? There were two things that happened in both of them that marked the end of the ETH Bitcoin drop. And you'll notice that ETH Bitcoin ended its descent after 3 red months in a row. It marked the final capitulation. Now, in 2016, that third red candle was the bottom. And then in the following month, it retested that low. It basically opened up at that level, retested that low, and then went up in the following year. In 2019, ETH Bitcoin, it dropped those 3 months, and then it wicked below the low the following month. So even though the following month was green, September, it did set a lower low in September. Now, I have gone back and forth on this so many times in my head, and I keep thinking like, well, which is it? How's it going to play out? At the end of the day, in a year, I think well, let's say, yeah, a year from now, ETH Bitcoin will probably be greater than 0.043, right? A year from now. So it might be one of those things that this is for academic purposes. It's not, I'm not trying to convince you of anything at this point. I tried to convince you for years, and some people listened and some people didn't. And at this point, I do think ETH Bitcoin is obviously much closer to the bottom than whatever a future top would be. But I'm looking at the chart now and I'm like, all right, 3 red months in a row. Could this be it? Right? It could, could it be it? And then there's this other part of me that's looking at it and I'm like, well, technically speaking, right? And as I've said before, technically correct is the best way to be correct. Technically speaking, we haven't actually had the 3rd red month yet. So it would be premature for me to get ahead of myself and say that it's been 3 red months in a row, right? Now, one of the things that you'll notice is you can actually pull characteristics from both 2016 and 2019 to explain what is happening this year in 2024. For instance, draw a line at the range low. That's what we're going to do. Look at 2024. Do you see the 3 tops? January, February, and May. Just like 2019. I pointed this out in real time, both on YouTube and on X, on Twitter, right? And it was interesting because I pointed them out ahead of time. I said this could happen. When it happened, people laughed, right? They're like, "Oh, you said it was going to go to 0.04." And I'm like, guys, this is what it did in 2019, right? Like it rallied in January, February, and May, and they all resulted in lower highs. And so then I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, it looks like 2019 in that regard. But where it doesn't look like 2019 is that these lows over here did not go below this low until final capitulation. So I'm like, all right, well, the other point to compare to is 2016, which was also a halving year for Bitcoin. And in that case, you can see that ETH Bitcoin did go below the low. There was a fake out below it, just like there was here. In April of 2024, there was a fake out in June of 2016. So there wasn't a fake out in 2019. So there's elements of 2016 in what's going on in 2024. There's also elements of what happened in 2019 going on in 2024. So then I remind myself, I'm like, okay, it's probably not going to play out exactly like either of them because it isn't either of them. It's different a little bit, right? It's a little different than 2016 and it's a little different than 2019. It's a combination of them, right? It's both of them together. It's the halving year for Bitcoin, but it's also the rate cut year. So then I go back to the monthly candles and I say, all right, if ETH Bitcoin, this is an if-then statement, right? If ETH Bitcoin closes down here, let's say it's a week from now, we're closing the month and ETH Bitcoin is still at 0.04 or something. Or maybe even below it, right? Maybe even below it. If that happens, then I would be willing to say that whatever happens in September could be the bottom. Just like it was in 2019, right? Just like it was in 2019. And just like it was in 2017, 2016 going into early 2017, right? That marked the low. But then I think to myself, okay, what am I missing? Like, what if it doesn't play out like that? And then I go back to my, I put my thinking cap back on. I'm like, okay, well, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's no guarantee it closes down here. As much as it seems like it's probably going to, there's no guarantee that it does. Base case, I don't really know. I don't really know what the base case should be. It's one of those things where the market can change so aggressively, so rapidly that I'd rather just wait and see and then talk about, all right, what is the most likely outcome from there? You might be wondering, well, what is there to look at? I mean, you have 3 red months here. You have 3 red months right here. And then you have 3 red months right here. And I mean, it looks really similar, especially if you draw these horizontal support levels that ETH Bitcoin eventually broke. If you look at weekly candles, what do you notice? After the range low was durably broken, right? Actually, I'm taking it up here. Right after it was broken here in October, it took a couple months to bottom, right? And then here it was broken in July. It took a couple months to bottom, September. Here, again, you're not looking at this because it was a fake out, just like it was over here in June. But if you're looking right here, it was July. So that means theoretically it would take 2 months to bottom, which would put it in September. Right? It would put it in September. So there's a great case to be made that ETH Bitcoin could bottom out in September. In fact, Bitcoin dominance often reverses course in September. It's got to be one of the main outlooks that you have. The other outlook that would tug away at that view, it's important to to turn over every stone and make sure, we're not missing something here. And that's to say, well, what if this changes? And then I was looking at 2019. Do you see this candle right here? A green candle back up. And then 2 red monthly candles. Now look at this, right? This green candle right here, green candle, and then 2 red monthly candles, where the first month stayed above the 20-week SMA, and then the second month went below the 20-week SMA. You see that? And then the third month wicked all the way down, where it dropped, where ETH Bitcoin dropped 18%. Here, ETH Bitcoin is down. It dropped about 19%. Remarkably, even though it dropped down there, it still somehow closed the month green. So you could have looked at those two red candles thinking, all right, this is it, because now you're going to have a third red month. At one point, right, this looked like 3 red months in a row, right? When this green wick was all the way down here. Caveat though, it wasn't it wasn't below this low, right? It wasn't below this low, but then somehow it turned green. Do you see that? And then I'm like, okay, well, how could that happen, right? I mean, like, ETH Bitcoin is at 0.043. If you look at ETH USD, this is what I'm looking at right now. This is the only reason I'm even considering this. ETH USD is nowhere near its 21-week EMA, right? It'd have to rally 10% to get there. Whereas Bitcoin is already at its 20-week SMA. In fact, the altcoin market is already at its 21-week EMA. So you have Ethereum really lagging behind. Now, I know a lot of people are going to use this opportunity to dunk on ETH, and you probably think that I would use it as an opportunity to dunk on ETH because I've been very bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation for a long time. But I have news for you. Ethereum is, in my opinion, better than all the other altcoins, right? I mean, I'll be honest, Bitcoin's the best, and it's not even close. But if I had to pick something beyond Bitcoin to take a risk in, it would be Ethereum. So I know some of you guys out there are like, well, this alt's going to flip it or that alt's going to flip it. I really don't think so, right? I really don't think so. So if ETH USD were to rally up to the bull market support band before the month is over, because Bitcoin's already there, right? Bitcoin's already there. If ETH does it before the month is over, then the ETH Bitcoin ratio could change a lot between now and the end of the month. And then you see what happened in 2019, where after it had that green, it had that move down, then it got 3 red months in a row after that, right? So it was 2 red, green, 3 red. So you have 2 red, green, 3 red. But if this ends up turning green, then it would be 2 red, green, 2 red, and then, right, you have 2 red, green, and then 3 red. So my point is that if this ends up being green, then it could sort of it could restart the process. It could restart the process of 3 red months in a row. Again, what should be the base case in this scenario, right? What should be? I don't really know. I mean, my instinct is to just say it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, 0.043, grand scheme of things, is going to be relatively decent value. But I could see a case for it going below 0.04. But I don't know if that's going to happen in September, or maybe it happens later on this year. And again, it's possible that 0.04 is the bottom. And I know some people are going to be like, well, why don't you just commit and say, but I honestly don't feel like I need to do that. I don't really think there are many people out there that, other than just say outright Bitcoin maxis, that have been bearish on ETH Bitcoin up until 0.04. I don't really think there have been. So for me to stick to my narrative for 3 years straight and say the minimum low for ETH Bitcoin is 0.04, and for it to finally go there, it's close. It could be it. But then again, I'm like, when you look at 2019, that move did not break the range low, right? So I'm like, is it really that, or are we just down here? And then I'm like, well, it's not 2019, right? It's not. It's a mixture of 2019 and 2016 where you had fake outs below the range low. So what I would say is this. To try to summarize the, whatever monstrosity I just served you guys up to try to digest, I would say this. If ETH Bitcoin goes down again into September, and the Fed then cuts, there's a good chance that's the bottom. There's a chance that the bottom's already in, right? But let's suppose the Fed cuts in September. Now, remember how I've said before that ETH Bitcoin bottomed out a month after the Fed cut? Well, I wonder if the reason it bottomed out a month after the Fed cut is because the first cut was only 25 basis points. You could make a case that had the Fed cut 50 basis points right away, then ETH Bitcoin would have bottomed out in 2019 rather than waiting. Now, right now, the market is saying that it's gonna be more likely a 25 basis point rate cut. I'll be honest with you guys. I think the Fed could get away with 50 basis points. I think they're gonna struggle to do 50 because they don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. And those mistakes that I'm referring to are, if you go over and look at inflation, and I'll tell you why I don't think it's as big of an issue this time. But if you look at inflation in the 1970s, there was a period right here in the summer of 1972 where inflation went sub 3%, and then it started to go back up. And you're wondering, is it just doing the same thing here? And then are we not just cutting too soon? But you know what's different about it this time compared to the 1972? And also why it makes sense to look at 1946 and 1949, where they ended up engineering a deflationary crash, right? They went too far. The reason why it makes sense is because if you look, right, if you go back and look at the unemployment rate, actually, let me just look at it over here, right? If you look at the unemployment rate in 1972, so we're going to look at the unemployment rate in 1972. What do you notice? Unemployment rate was going down, right? So, it wasn't going up. Like, it's going up now. It was going down back then. So, why was the Fed going to lose? Like, why was the Fed doing what they were doing, whatever the hell they were doing back then? Like, why were they doing it? The unemployment rate was falling. But now it's going up. So the issue is that the unemployment rate doesn't tend to just go sideways, right? It's usually trending in one direction or the other. So because of that, I would say the Fed could probably get away with a 50 basis point rate cut. I don't know if they're going to do it, but let's suppose that they do. If they cut 50 basis points and then ETH Bitcoin, say, drops for the rest of August and then bottoms out September, I would be willing to say there's good evidence that the low is in. Now I feel like I'm 20 to 30% of the way there. Okay? I'm like 20 to 30% of the way there. But you just look at the 2019 move, right? And you can see, right? You can see that it did go a little bit lower in September. So I'm 20 to 30% of the way there in terms of just being willing to say that. But then what happens if it bounces here, right? Like, what happens if ETH/USD closes this gap and it rallies while Bitcoin gets pinned at its 20-week moving average? If that happens, then ETH Bitcoin could repeat what it did right here in May of 2019, where it looked like it was breaking down and it looked like it was the third month in a row, but then somehow it ended up turning green. And then guess what? And then it dropped for 3 months in a row and then bottomed in the fourth month. Guess what? If this month turns green and then the next three are red, September, October, November, and then bottom out in December. Here it bottomed out in December, right? So, do you see where I'm coming from? And I'm like, which is it, right? Which is it? Is ETH going to close? There does exist a scenario, by the way, which I should say. There does exist a scenario where ETH Bitcoin closes where it is right now by the end of the month, right? There does. And in that scenario, if ETH/USD then closes the gap in September, then you could easily make the case that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out, before December. But that's sort of dependent on, does ETH/USD fall back down here or does it immediately go back up? If you look at 2019, when ETH/USD fell in August, you can see that it ended up starting its uptrend. It didn't start its uptrend until September. Do you see that? It didn't start this uptrend until September. By the way, that is exactly where ETH Bitcoin bottomed out, when it started its uptrend in September. That's where ETH Bitcoin bottomed. That is exactly where Bitcoin dominance topped, the week of September 2nd. Now, Look at 2016. ETH USD started really its uptrend August 29th, right? That was the first week. I mean, it was basically already September when it really started to move up. So if ETH USD does not really close this gap here until September, then it means that ETH Bitcoin is potentially free to close its monthly candle below the range low. And that is what ultimately needs to happen. Now, remember, what happened last 2 cycles when ETH Bitcoin closed a monthly candle below the range low? Look closely, because it happened both times. The first monthly close below the range low was not the bottom. It was the following 1 to 2 months. Same thing here. The first monthly close below the range low was not the bottom. It was the following 2 months. The caveat, just to play devil's advocate, right? Just to play devil's advocate, is that when ETH Bitcoin closed the monthly candle below the range low in both 2016 and in 2019, it was the second of the third monthly candles, right? So it was the second candle out of 3, right? The second candle out of 3. This right here is the third candle. So how could it get back in line? Well, I mean, if ETH USD rallied to the 20-week SMA and then ETH Bitcoin got back up here, and then the next month it did something like this where it like if it ended up being green and then the next month it turned red again, and then the following month it broke down, then it would be very similar to both 2016 and 2019. But I don't have a crystal ball. I don't. And I don't know which is the more likely outcome. I honestly feel like it's almost a coin flip, because it kind of depends on what your bias is, right? I mean, if you think that ETH Bitcoin is going to bottom in September, there's tons of evidence for it, right? I mean, the Fed's going to be cutting in September. Based on Powell's dovish tone, it seems like they really are starting to get spooked. Therefore, looser monetary policy is on the way. So why? What's the need to wait until December? Maybe December is just a higher low. And if you look at 2016 and 2019, the real uptrend by ETH USD didn't even occur until September. So if ETH USD does not close the gap to the 20-week SMA between now and the end of August, then ETH Bitcoin gets its monthly close below support. It all depends on what happens in the next week. But if you were to tell me, if you're from the future and you told me that ETH Bitcoin doesn't bottom until December, find a path for it. It's easy. It's easy to find that path, right? All you do is you say, okay, well, it closes this gap before the end of August, therefore causing ETH Bitcoin to go back up and not get its monthly close below the range low. And then the Fed cuts in September, but they only cut 25 basis points, which is not enough. Just like it wasn't enough back over here in July, because in July of 2019, the Fed cut 25 basis points, and it wasn't enough, and ETH Bitcoin kept going down, and it went down until after the second rate cut. And the second rate cut isn't coming until November. It's really fascinating, honestly. I mean, it's funny how it's so easy to find a narrative to support either outcome, right? You could make a case for ETH Bitcoin bottoming out in the August to September timeframe. You could make a case for it taking until November, December. My point is this, okay? I'm just being honest. I don't know. I don't know which one it's going to be. I think it's honestly a coin flip. It depends on what happens with ETH over the next week. In September, I think we'll have a lot more information as to what's the most likely outcome, because then we'll have the monthly close. We'll know if ETH Bitcoin had a monthly close below 0.04904. So I think it might have been 0.04907 or 8. I can't remember. It was 0.04908. So that's the magic number, 0.04908. A monthly close below that would be very helpful in understanding where ETH Bitcoin bottoms out. If it does not get a monthly close below this, below 0.049 this month, then it would reset the clock and make it so that it might take until the end of the year. So there you have it, right? I mean, I wish that for so long, it's just been so obvious to me, right? It's been so obvious that ETH Bitcoin is going down. Okay, it's been very easy for me to like make that claim because of tighter and tighter monetary policy. But I also, I'm listening to what Powell is saying. I'm seeing what's happening in the labor market. Because the labor market is softening up, it means looser monetary policy is coming. And because looser monetary policy is coming, it means that Bitcoin dominance is likely going to top out soon. One other thing I wanted to point out, because there are so many similarities with 2019 still, do you see this right here? You see how ETH Bitcoin had a big drop right there? And then it had a green candle. And then the next month was red. Or sorry, the next week was red. And then the next week after that swept the low. And then the following week was the bottom. It's the exact same week. This capitulation there occurred the week of August 5th. Go to this time. This week here, capitulation occurred the week of August 5th. The green candle that occurred just after it occurred the week of August 12th, just like we had over here. The third candle is red, the week of August 19th, just like it was in 2019. And then in 2019, the week of August 26th was red, and then the week of September 2nd was red. How could that be, right? Does there exist a scenario where ETH USD goes back to its 20-week SMA and ETH Bitcoin does not break down? Yes, if Bitcoin goes up quicker, right? If Bitcoin continues going up and it lifts ETH up, then you could have a scenario where where ETH USD goes up to its 20-week SMA, but Bitcoin's much higher than its 20-week SMA, and then it could still all make sense. But do you see that? And then ETH Bitcoin bottomed the week of September 2nd. So it's definitely possible that is what could happen here, where it just kind of slowly goes back down, bottoms the week of September 2nd. Now, you want to see something that's a little eerie? It's a little eerie. Do you see the low from May in 2019? Guess where it was? 0.024. 0.024. Where was the low in May of 2024? 0.044. 0.044. So 0.024 in 2019, 0.044 in 2024. 2024, a lot of fours. Where was the actual low? 0.016. 0.016. If you extrapolate that pattern, 0.036. Potentially. 0.036. Is that possible? You want to see something really weird? Take a fib retracement tool from the March 2016 high on ETH Bitcoin and expand it out. ETH Bitcoin got rejected this cycle at the 2.618. And then here in the summer of 22, it bottomed at the 1.618. If it were to go back down to the 2016 high, you see that? That's the one. It's just one, right? That's where we're measuring it from. That's 0.036. Is that a coincidence, right? I mean, you add on, this was 0.044, or sorry, this was 0.024, that was 0.044. This low ended up being 0.016. What if this low ends up being 0.036, which is the same level that it topped at in 2016? It's possible. And that, I mean, if ETH Bitcoin were at 0.036, I would, I would be I would certainly think that, I don't know, maybe I'd say like I'm 70% sure, right? That would be the low. Um, I would say worst case. If you're asking me what my like, worst case scenario is for this cycle for ETH Bitcoin, I honestly don't really think it's going to go there if I'm being honest, right? I would say this optimistic case. So, optimistic is 0.04, meaning the optimistic case is the bottom is Zen. And honestly, I have not been on board with that idea for years, but it's a possibility, right? Let's not pretend like it can't happen. It could. Bitcoin dominance is close to 60%. It's always possible that the way it gets to 60%, if it goes there, is because all Bitcoin pairs are breaking down. Moderate view, 0.036. Reasonable, right? It could happen, right? It's not impossible for that to happen. Worst case, 0.03, right? In fact, if you look at the fib extension here, this 0.786 is at 0.03. That's what I would say is worst case. Not my base case. Not my base case. What I would say is that is my base case, moderate view. But every month that goes by between now and December where it doesn't go there, then I would say I would more so lean towards the optimistic view. So it really depends on the timing, right? So like right now, I would say 20 to 30% likelihood that the low is in. But if we're still sitting at 0.043 and it's like December 30th, then I would just say the bottom is probably in, and then I would be more like 70, 80% sure at that point. But right now, as it stands right now, I would say, the moderate view is still a potential outcome. The optimistic view is potential outcome. The worst case scenario is potential outcome. If I had to order these, I'd say moderate is the most likely, optimistic is the second most likely, worst case is the third most likely. That's what I would say. And again, I'm not just saying, that it can't go to 0.03 because I want it to turn around. I honestly don't really care if it goes to 0.03. I just think that in a year, you're probably not going to care. So again, academic purposes only. Do with it what you want. I certainly don't think it makes sense to wait until August of 2024 to convert ETH to Bitcoin. I think the time to do that was 2 or 3 years ago. Now it's more so time to look for the reverse trade, if anything. Now, a lot of Bitcoin maxis are going to eat me alive for saying that kind of stuff. And I really, and I've been honest with you guys a long time about this, that like it's been easy for the last 3 years because I just put on my Bitcoin maxi hat at the beginning of 2022. I knew this was coming because I knew I had tracked a lot of Bitcoin maxis just talking about Bitcoin dominance for the last 3 years. But I got to be honest, guys, I think dominance is going to go down next year. And I think we're likely going to see ETH Bitcoin carve out a bottom between now and the end of the year. It's possible that it could, the two paths, right? If it follows sort of those paths we talked about earlier, one path is this, something like this maybe. Another path could be this, right? Something like that. A more moderate path could just be this, where it just kind of bounces around 0.04 for a while and then goes up. But I think when we look back at this in a year, it's going to do one of those three things. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.